Story 1: The Whispers of Pine Hollow. Emily and her friends Jake, Mia, and Alex were excited for their weekend getaway at Pine Hollow National Park. The sun hung low in the sky as they drove through winding roads lined with towering pine trees. Upon arrival, they set up camp near a pristine lake, surrounded by the dense forest and the sounds of nature. It was the perfect escape from their busy lives. That evening, they gathered around a crackling campfire, sharing laughter and stories under a blanket of stars. As the night deepened, Jake, always the jokester, began to tell a local legend about the Whispering Woods. He spoke of a spirit known to roam the park, enticing campers with melodic whispers that echoed through the trees. Once you heard the whispers, he warned, it was too late to escape. The group chuckled nervously at the tale, dismissing it as just another ghost story. They settled into their sleeping bags, comforted by the warmth of the fire and the sounds of the night. But as the hours passed, the serene ambience shifted. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves and creating an unsettling atmosphere. Around midnight, as Emily was drifting off to sleep, she was jolted awake by soft whispers that seemed to float through the air. They were indistinct at first, like the gentle lapping of water against the shore, but soon transformed into a haunting melody. Curious, she unzipped her tent and peeked outside. The moon bathed the campsite in an ethereal glow, but the forest beyond was shrouded in darkness. The whispers called to her, clear and inviting, "Emily, come play with us." It was as if the very trees were beckoning her closer. Heart racing, Emily hesitated. She glanced back at her friends, sleeping soundly, oblivious to the growing terror around her. Ignoring the gnawing sense of dread, she stepped away from the campfire's warmth, drawn toward the woods. As she entered the trees, the whispers intensified, swirling around her like a soft breeze. The forest felt alive, the shadows stretching and shifting in the moonlight. She stumbled deeper into the woods, the darkness growing thicker. Suddenly, the whispers became a cacophony of laughter, echoing around her. "Come join us, Emily." Forever panic surged through her as she realized she was lost. She turned to retrace her steps, but the forest had changed. The familiar path had vanished, replaced by twisting roots and gnarled branches. As she ran, the laughter transformed into agonizing screams, echoing her name in a mocking tone. Hours later, Jake, Mia, and Alex woke to find Emily missing. Anxiety settled over them as they searched the campsite for any sign of her. When they found her tent empty, they set off into the woods, calling her name. "Emily," they shouted, their voices swallowed by the oppressive silence. As they ventured deeper into the forest, they felt an overwhelming sense of unease. The trees seemed to loom over them, their branches curling like skeletal fingers. Every rustle of leaves sent shivers down their spines. Time slipped away, and desperation clawed at them as they searched. Just as hope began to fade, they stumbled into a small clearing. In the center stood a moss-covered rock, and on it was carved a single word, "Whisper." It was then they heard the soft, melodious call echoing through the trees. They looked at one another in terror. "Emily," Mia cried, but the only response was the eerie whispering, now drawing nearer. Shadows flickered between the trees, dark figures darting just out of sight. As fear tightened around them, they decided to return to camp. But the path felt unfamiliar, twisted, and wrong. Back at the campsite, Emily's belongings were untouched. Jake felt a chill creep over him. What if she's in trouble? "We have to find her." They resumed their search, their hearts pounding. The whispers grew louder, wrapping around them like tendrils of fog, urging them to turn back. The sun began to set, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for them. As darkness fell, the forest came alive with an unsettling energy. Each crack of a twig echoed like a gunshot in the silence. Then, just as they were about to give up hope, they saw her. Emily stood at the edge of the clearing, her back turned toward them, the moonlight casting a pale glow over her figure. Relief flooded through them, but as they approached, a sickening realization dawned. Her hair hung disheveled, and her skin appeared unnaturally pale. "Emily," Alex called out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned her head, revealing eyes that seemed hollow and void of life. "Come play with us," she whispered, her voice distant and echoing, as if it belonged to someone else. The shadows in the trees grew darker, closing in around them. Panic surged as they realized Emily was no longer herself. She stepped closer, the darkness enveloping her like a shroud. The whispers intensified, turning into a deafening roar. In that moment, the friends understood the truth. They were not alone in the woods. As the darkness consumed them, they felt the weight of despair settle in their hearts. The whispers echoed their names as they were drawn into the shadows, leaving only the flickering campfire behind. Pine Hollow had claimed its next victims, the cycle of the whispers continuing with every unsuspecting camper who dared to enter. End of the story. Story 2. The Campfire Shadows. A group of 5 friends, Sarah, Brian, Lily, Tom, and Rachel, decided to celebrate the end of summer with a camping trip to Redwood National Park. They arrived in the early afternoon, the sun filtering through the ancient trees, casting a dappled pattern on the forest floor. Excited chatter filled the air as they set up camp, laughing and teasing each other while they prepared for a weekend of adventure. As the sun dipped below the horizon, they gathered around the campfire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories of their childhood adventures. The crackling fire illuminated their faces, but soon the conversation turned to the darker tales of the park. "I heard there's a legend about a group of campers who vanished here decades ago," Brian said, leaning in closer to the fire. "They were last seen near the lake, and every year since, people claim to have seen shadowy figures moving through the trees at night." Lily scoffed. "Come on, Brian, that's just an old wives' tale. You really expect us to believe in ghosts?" "Maybe it's not ghosts," Tom chimed in, a glint of mischief in his eyes. "What if it's something worse? Something that preys on unsuspecting campers?" The group laughed, but Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. "Stop it, you guys. You're ruining the mood." They finished their marshmallows and settled in for the night, the stars twinkling above. As they prepared to sleep, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She dismissed it as paranoia, but it lingered in the back of her mind. Around midnight, Sarah woke to strange noises outside her tent. Rustling leaves and faint whispers filled the air. She glanced at her friends, all sound asleep, and her heart raced. She unzipped the tent cautiously, peering out into the darkness. The moonlight illuminated the campsite, but the trees loomed ominously at the edge of the clearing. The rustling stopped, and an eerie silence enveloped the area. As she stood frozen, a low growl rumbled from the depths of the forest. Fear gripped her, and she quickly zipped the tent shut, her heart pounding in her chest. The next morning, her friends noticed that Brian was missing. His tent was empty, the sleeping bag undisturbed. Panic set in as they searched the campsite, calling his name. "Brian," they shouted, but their voices echoed back in silence. We have to find him, Rachel insisted, her eyes wide with fear. The group set off into the woods, retracing their steps from the previous day. The shadows felt deeper, the trees seemed too close in around them, and the familiar path twisted into an unfamiliar maze. As they ventured deeper, Sarah's unease grew. She could almost feel the forest watching them, the shadows shifting just out of sight. The rustling noises returned, and the growl echoed from the darkness, sending chills down her spine. "Guys, we need to turn back," she urged, but the others were determined to find Brian. They pressed on, calling his name, but the only responses were the mocking whispers that seemed to come from the trees themselves. Hours passed, and desperation turned into dread. They stumbled upon a small clearing where a single, moss-covered rock stood ominously in the center. On it was carved the word whisper. Just as they began to comprehend its meaning, the shadows around them thickened, and the whispers intensified, echoing their fears. Suddenly, the ground beneath them shifted, and they felt a rush of wind. The shadows swirled, taking on forms that danced just out of reach. Panic surged through them as they ran, but the forest seemed to shift, the trees closing in on their escape routes. In the chaos, they found themselves back at their campsite. Relief washed over them, but it was short-lived. There, by the fire, sat Brian, his back turned to them. They rushed to him, their hearts pounding with hope, but as they drew closer, unease settled in their stomachs. He sat motionless, staring blankly into the flames as if entranced. "Brian," Sarah called out, her voice trembling. "We've been looking for you. Where have you been?" He didn't respond, his expression vacant. The shadows danced around him, flickering in the firelight, casting grotesque shapes on the ground. "Brian," Lily shouted, shaking him lightly, but he remained unresponsive. Fear gripped them as they exchanged worried glances. "Something's not right," Rachel whispered. "We should get out of here." Suddenly, Brian turned his head slowly, his eyes devoid of recognition. They were eerily empty, like dark voids reflecting nothing. "You shouldn't have come back," he said in a voice that sounded distant, echoing as if coming from somewhere far away. "You're not supposed to be here." "What do you mean?" Tom asked, stepping back. "What happened to you?" A slow smile crept across Brian's face, but it lacked warmth. There was something sinister behind it. "They were waiting," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They want to play with you." Panic surged within the group as they took a step back, their instincts screaming for them to flee. The atmosphere shifted, the air thickening with an oppressive energy. They could hear whispers now, a chorus of voices rising from the depths of the forest, swirling around them like a storm. "Join us. Stay forever." Suddenly, the shadows began to pulse, coalescing into dark figures that slipped between the trees. The figures emerged, distorted and monstrous, their forms twisting and writhing in unnatural ways. Eyes glinted from the darkness, watching them, waiting. "Brian, come with us." One of the figures beckoned in a voice that sounded eerily like his. "We can be together." "No," Rachel screamed, her heart racing. "Brian, fight it. Come back to us." But Brian simply sat there, an unsettling calmness enveloping him as he stared into the shadows. The figures drew closer, their whispers growing louder, drowning out their voices. In that moment, Sarah felt a pull from the darkness, as if the forest was trying to siphon her away. "Run," Tom yelled, breaking the spell. They turned and bolted into the trees, fear propelling them forward as they raced into the underbrush. Branches whipped at their faces, and the whispers pursued them, weaving through the air like a malevolent wind. They dashed deeper into the forest, trying to escape the pursuing shadows. As they ran, the ground seemed to shift beneath them, and the trees appeared to close in, narrowing their paths. The laughter grew louder, echoing through the woods. It felt as if the very forest was alive, taunting them with their every step. Desperation clawed at their throats as they stumbled into a small clearing. They collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, but the shadows followed. They circled the clearing, their whispers becoming more urgent, more insistent. "Join us, become one with the forest," they chanted in unison, their voices blending into a haunting melody. "We can't let them take us," Lily cried, trying to stay focused. "We need to find a way out." In that moment, Sarah remembered the old tales Brian had shared, the ones that warned about acknowledging the spirits in the woods. "We can't respond to them. Don't listen to their voices." The others nodded, clinging to each other in a tight circle, focusing on their own breaths and each other rather than the darkness that surrounded them. As the figures grew closer, the air crackled with tension. The shadows lunged forward, but when they reached the edge of the clearing, they halted, as if an invisible barrier had formed. "Fools," one of the figures shrieked. "You think you can resist? You belong to the forest now." With that, the shadows surged, but the group stood firm, chanting together, "We are not yours. We refuse." The whispers grew chaotic, a cacophony of anger and frustration echoing through the trees. The shadows writhed and shrieked, their forms flickering in and out of view. For a moment, the forest seemed to tremble, and the figures faltered. "Stay with us," another figure cried, reaching out with long, gnarled fingers, but it recoiled as if struck by an invisible force. Taking advantage of the moment, Sarah led her friends away from the clearing, the trees parting as if granting them passage. They ran as fast as their legs could carry them, navigating the winding paths that felt alive with every footstep. Finally, they broke through the tree line and stumbled onto a dirt road, their campsite visible in the distance. They raced toward it, the whispers fading behind them. They reached their tents, hearts pounding, and flung open the flaps to find Brian standing in the same spot, still staring into the darkness, but now with a flicker of recognition. "Brian," Sarah shouted, rushing to him. "You have to come with us. We need to leave." He blinked, confusion washing over his features. What happened? The shadows loomed at the edge of the trees, watching, waiting for their chance to reclaim what they believed was theirs. "We have to go now," Tom urged, grabbing Brian's arm. They hurriedly packed their belongings, hearts racing, glancing nervously at the encroaching darkness. As they prepared to leave, they felt a chill in the air, a sense of foreboding creeping in. Just as they were about to walk away, the whispers returned, soft and inviting. "You can stay. You belong here. Run," Sarah shouted, and they took off down the road, leaving their campsite behind. As they reached the park entrance, they didn't look back. The whispers faded into the night, but the lingering feeling of being watched remained. They piled into the car, breathless and shaken, determined never to return. As they drove away, the forest loomed large in the rearview mirror, dark and foreboding. Brian stared out the window, a strange emptiness in his gaze, as if a part of him still lingered within the trees. The remaining friends exchanged worried glances, knowing the shadows of Redwood National Park would forever haunt them, a reminder of the night they almost became part of the forest itself. End of story. Story 3, The Blood Moon Campers. In the heart of Whispering Pines National Park, a group of friends Nina, Mark, Jess, and Leo planned a weekend camping trip to celebrate their last summer before college. The park was renowned for its stunning views and serene landscapes, but rumors of strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances had given it a haunting reputation. Undeterred, the friends packed their gear and set off, eager for adventure. As they set up their campsite, they laughed and joked, brushing off the local legends about a blood moon that supposedly awakened malevolent spirits in the woods. "It's just a story to scare kids," Mark said, rolling his eyes. The others nodded in agreement, but a seed of unease had already begun to take root in Nina's mind. That evening, the sky darkened, and a deep crimson hue emerged as the blood moon rose, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. The friends gathered around the campfire, sharing ghost stories and roasting marshmallows, the flickering flames illuminating their excited faces. But as the moon climbed higher, a strange tension settled over the group. Around midnight, they decided to take a hike to a nearby viewpoint to see the moon from a better perspective. The woods felt different, alive, and charged with an energy that was both exhilarating and unsettling. The trees loomed overhead, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As they reached the viewpoint, the view was breathtaking. The moon hung low in the sky, bathing the valley in a surreal, blood-red light. They snapped photos, capturing the moment, but something in the atmosphere felt wrong. An unnatural silence enveloped the area, the usual sounds of the night, crickets, rustling leaves absent. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl echoed from the woods, sending chills down their spines. The friends exchanged nervous glances, their laughter dying on their lips. "What was that?" Jess whispered, her voice trembling. "I think we should head back," Leo suggested, his eyes darting toward the trees. "This place is starting to creep me out." As they turned to leave, the growl came again, closer this time, followed by a chorus of whispers that seemed to rise from the shadows. "Stay, join us." Fear surged through them, and they began to walk quickly, the path winding through the dark trees. The shadows seemed to shift and dance around them, and Nina felt an inexplicable urge to look back, as if something was following them. As they hurried back to camp, the air thickened with tension. The whispers grew louder, echoing their fears. "Stay, join us." The friends began to run, the laughter from earlier replaced by panicked breaths and frantic footsteps. When they finally burst into the clearing where their campsite was, they were met with an unsettling sight. Their tents were standing, but the fire was extinguished, and their belongings lay scattered across the ground. A sense of dread filled the air, and they realized that something was horribly wrong. "Where's the fire?" Mark asked, his voice shaky. "I thought we left it burning." Nina scanned the area, her heart racing. "We need to get out of here," she urged, but as they turned to leave, the shadows around them grew darker, more solid. The whispers escalated into frantic cries, filling the air with a cacophony of despair. "Join us, you can't leave." The shadows twisted and formed figures, faces appearing in the darkness, eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. Panicked, they grabbed their gear, but the shadows lunged at them, forcing them back into the clearing. The friends huddled together, their backs against the cold earth. "We need to find a way out," Jess cried, tears streaming down her face. Suddenly, a figure stepped forward from the shadows, a gaunt, ethereal woman with long, flowing hair and eyes that seemed to absorb the light around her. "You've come for the blood moon," she said, her voice a haunting melody. You belong to us now. What do you want? Leo shouted, his voice cracking. Your souls, she replied, smiling wickedly. You have trespassed on sacred ground, and now you will pay the price. In that moment, the shadows surged forward, and the friends felt a powerful force dragging them toward the figure. Desperation took hold as they fought against the unseen force, clawing at the ground to hold their ground. Run! Nina screamed, and without hesitation, they broke free from the shadow's grasp, sprinting into the trees. They dashed through the underbrush, hearts pounding, fear propelling them forward. As they ran, the whispers turned into anguished cries, echoing in the night. You can't escape. Join us. They burst onto a narrow path, but it seemed to shift and twist, leading them in circles. The forest felt alive, guiding them back toward the clearing, toward the figure that awaited them. Panic set in as they realized they were trapped. Nina could feel the ground tremble beneath her feet, as if the earth itself was conspiring against them. This way, she shouted, pulling the others toward a narrow opening between two massive trees. They squeezed through, the branches scratching at their skin, but the darkness was closing in behind them. They stumbled into a small glade, the blood moon hanging ominously overhead. It was quieter here, but the air felt thick with dread. What now? Mark panted, glancing back at the shadows lurking at the edge of the trees. We can't give up, Jess said, determination sparking in her eyes. We have to find a way to break the curse. In the center of the glade stood a large stone altar, covered in strange symbols and ancient carvings. Nina felt a pull toward it, as if the altar was calling to her. Maybe we can offer something, she suggested, glancing at the others. If we give them something they want, maybe they'll let us go. Like what? Leo asked, his face pale. Something personal, Nina replied, her heart racing. It has to mean something. They each stepped forward, pulling off pieces of jewelry, watches, and other personal items, laying them on the altar. This is our offering, Nina declared, her voice trembling. We didn't mean to intrude. We want to leave. The air grew still as the shadows hesitated, and for a moment, hope flickered in their hearts. The whispers quieted, replaced by a tense silence. But just as they began to believe it would work, the ground trembled violently, and the shadows surged forward, more furious than before. No, it is not enough, the woman shrieked, her voice echoing with rage. You will not escape. Fear flooded their hearts as the shadows closed in. In a final desperate act, Nina reached for the altar and screamed, We are not afraid of you. We are leaving. The ground shook violently, and a blinding light erupted from the altar, forcing the shadows to retreat. The figures shrieked in pain, their forms distorting as the light consumed them. In that moment of chaos, the friends seized their chance. They ran back through the narrow opening, the whispers fading behind them. They burst through the tree line and onto the dirt road, collapsing on the ground, gasping for air. As they looked back at the forest, the shadows retreated, and the blood moon began to fade, returning to its ordinary state. They had escaped, but the night would forever haunt them. As dawn broke over the horizon, they drove away from Whispering Pines National Park, hearts heavy with the knowledge of what they had encountered. The forest loomed behind them, dark and foreboding, a silent witness to their terror. They had come for adventure, but they left with a chilling reminder that some places were not meant to be explored, especially under the blood moon. End of the story.